broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
This is our official start of our DP2 microlearning on Output and Workflow Revisited. And welcome to everyone. It's great to see you all here. And I can kind of visualize you all and be speaking to you real time as I go. This presentation is really going to be about some of the different aspects of rendering and print and precedence of one table and field over another. None of it is, brand new, but based on some of the tickets that we've seen and some of the other things that are happening, we felt it was time to revisit, especially precedence, because we all do the same thing. It's like, which of those fields overrides which table? And so we've been working to kind of dig through some of the archives and work through some experiments to see kind of where things are, and just kind of give you guys a new overview of it. So in this case, I'm going to think of this more as a workflow than anything else, and it really is a workflow. But I want to talk about it not so much in terms of each individual table, but as the relationships of the tables to each other. So as we look at these different aspects, and in some cases it's functionality, in most cases it's a table, I'm going to be talking about specific things in each one as ways of giving you examples of what might have precedence over the other given a particular scenario. And I think that's really the important part of this, is that we're going to be looking at examples in a way to expose certain things in certain tables and certain types of functionality. And I debated about how to do this. Should I start with like one table and then work my way back? Should I start with the job and work my way to the render engine? But in the end, I decided that the place to start was going to be the render engine, and I'm going to start there because the way that I'm going to work through some of these concepts and rules, if you will, right, will be to look at how they play out, right? So, and the render engine is kind of the heart of that. So that's really why I decided that I would go ahead and start there. So I'm going to go ahead and roll right into DP2 and kind of talk about each bit of functionality as we go, so that I can kind of begin from where I set out to do. So I'm just going to go straight to printing, and there's some basic DP2 Insights videos that cover, this is what this button does, that's still pretty accurate. So I'm not going to cover some of the real basic stuff, it's like each one of these buttons and what it does. But I do want to kind of start from, any render engine, and I'm going to go through kind of from the back forward, and that's going to be true for the tables as well. So in each case, I'm going to kind of go to the example and try to use the example as a way to talk about what I want to bring to your attention. So in the first case, and when we're talking about the render engine, that's kind of where I want to start. I want to talk a little bit about, and I'm looking at my audience, I'm thinking every one of you knows this, but I'll remind you anyway, right? When I'm looking at a render engine, I can start multiple printers, from within the same render engine. And a single render engine is limited to about 2 gigabytes of memory. In reality, that's about 1.2. So that's really kind of what you have actively. So if I have another printer running, all of those printers that I'm running are going to be sharing that same little bit of memory. So if you had 5 or 6 of these running on a box, right, you're going to want to be thinking about the capacity of that box and what the system is capable of doing and what's happening on, can we use multiple CPUs, can we use multiple threads, and so on. I'm just going to start a couple as an example, but I did kind of want to start there at that core piece of what's happening with the render engine, so that if you did have 5 or 6 of these going, you would still be bumping up against what that maximum is. So there's a couple of different things that you can think about doing, if you wanted to run multiple printers, right? What kind of work is running through it? If you had one, you had one printer that was running very large work and large images, would you really want to be running that with other printers at the same time from a single render engine? You could also, when it comes to the render engine, you could have multiple instances of DP2. If you had if the processing power of the computer was able to handle such a thing, because the render engine is designed to take advantage of whatever processing power. In fact, I think, if I remember right, it will pretty much grab everything but one. And so the render engine is kind of greedy, and it's a lot of the time when we talk about what's happening on a particular workstation, we'll talk about processor intensive operations, and the render engine being kind of the biggest and the greediest in a lot of different operations. Not everything, but certainly in a lot of them. So it's something to think about as you're using the render engine on a particular box, is kind of how you're using it, what type of work is going through it, and how you have that work set up, what's automated and what isn't. So it's something to think about. Another aspect of that is, before I'm going to go through a couple of the tabs, but before I do that, one other kind of umbrella piece of that, and this is something that came up just recently in a ticket that we did, was the concept of throttling. Throttling isn't something that you see there's a button. What happens with throttling is if the render engine, if it's a way for the render engine to prevent filling up a hard drive. So if the printer can't keep up with the render engine, and generally speaking it's at about 120 images, the render engine may actually kind of suspend itself, and it'll appear to be in a suspended state. And in fact, in the job queue, some of the images may actually come up, and this is another ticket that was recent, come up with the state of saved. If they weren't stopped manually, they might be in a state of saved. But once it gets down below that threshold, the render engine will flip itself back on and start operation again, and the images in the job queue will go ahead and should revert and head off to the printer as normal. But it's one of those things that we talk about, and it's a word that we've seen some confusion around, so I wanted to make sure to mention that. There are some tools that you can use, and I see pretty much everybody in my audience, I think these are just like helpful reminders to you, but I'll kind of talk about them a little bit, because as an example, on the diagnostic tag, and as I said, I'm kind of going to go a little bit backwards. If you are a lab that is kind of from an admin or a production standpoint, really kind of looking at your work and trying to understand how DP2 is behaving, one thing, of course, you can get to the session log from here. It'll open up the current session log. You can also, if you are trying to understand what's happening, we do have a memory monitor. Now, it says in the help not to mess with these dials, but I'm thinking, you've got a lot of skill. So when you'll just have one more tool. One other thing I should mention, I have the resolution of my screen up larger than I would normally run DP2, so some of the screens may look a little bit awkward, but I did that in hopes that it will make it easier for you to see and easier for this to display on the video, because we are recording it, so you can go back and reference it. But on the setup tab, this is something that I think a lot of us don't look at often enough. So I'm going to do the show setup, because there's something about this that I think is really just kind of the key piece of this, is that it does show you what's happening kind of throughout the system. So it's going to show you all of the things that are a reflection of the printer data table, the printer queue, and in some cases the job itself, so that, and the job queue, so that you could really, from a kind of a high level, get a real good look at what that setup is, so that if there's some confusion about what's going on, you get this kind of one nice list that you can take a look at. So the open tables is another one that I do want to just, if you are kind of trying to understand your workflow and trying to understand what's going on and taking a look, it's going to go ahead and open up all three of the relevant tables just to the queue that you're looking at and to the printer that you're looking at. It's not going to show you everything, but it can be really nice to be able to see very quickly just what's happening, just what's in that queue, and so on. There's a couple of other ways to get there, but this happens to be one that I think can be really helpful from a production management standpoint. It's just kind of, again, a friendly reminder that these things are here. The Performance tab, which is another place that's going to allow you to kind of manage what's going on and really kind of think about what you're going to want to do. As I said before, right, we want to do as much as we can, as efficiently as we can, and we want to automate it in a way that's, helpful for the lab. So, and as I said before, the render engine's designed for threading, right? It wants to use up as much as it can so that it can get as much work done as quickly as you need it to get done. So the concurrent, right, which the default is set to 2, that basically tells the render engine how many simultaneous renders is what's in the tooltip, but really that is, how many order items to render at the same time, right? So you could dial it way up depending on if you had small ones. You might want to dial it down if you had really large jobs, right? If you had really big images. This is the kind of thing that will help you to kind of tweak the behavior and what's going on. And you've got the ability here, a couple of different things, right? And I'm going to kind of skip. Some of this is, the guys did, and I see the Tom's on the line, so I'll give you a head nod there. Some of these are very straightforward, right? So as to allow the image resize during read. So if you have an image that's a large image and it's being resized down to a small image, it'll allow it to do that before it places it in memory and begins to operate it on it. The work delay is after 20 seconds of idle, DP2 is going to check here to see how long should I wait before I go and look for more work, things like that. Again, these are just simple little tools, but we tend to, in our day-to-day, as we're kind of in a day-to-day hurry, we tend to forget that we need to, we have these settings saved. And these are, when you change things, this is another place where you want to be sure to update your setup and save it. The printer controls, we know what those are, and I'm not going to go through these, but, specific device, and then, of course, operations, which is where we see what we've got. And so the fundamental things here that I wanted to kind of go over were just some of these other tools where you can get a sense of what's going on, just sort of what's happening with the render engine, and a couple of other pieces of this and how it's going to work. From here, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up the bigger table, but I want to start with the printer data table and kind of work my way back. And that's going to allow me to talk a little bit about precedence. What is taking precedence over some other field in another table based on the way that you have things set up. And I'm doing it that way so that there's some things I want to highlight. There's some things that happen in the printer data table that don't happen in the printer queue. And in fact, we've started an Excel spreadsheet to see, so we could kind of compare and really begin to look at some of the differences between the tables, because it's been a long time since we've actually done a complete look at all the fields. And we add fields in different tables, based on whatever the feature set is that we're working on. So I'm going to start with the printer data table. And I'm going to actually start from the back end of the printer data table. I have quite a few in here. You probably have hundreds more. But the reason I want to start here is because it gives me the ability to sort of reference some of the fields that have been there forever, and to talk a little bit about, the kinds of things we used to say, and realizing now that maybe we need to say them a little more clearly, or maybe we need to reinforce some of the concepts around that. So as an example, we have a lot of color and contrast, and if you haven't, don't remember exactly, and maybe I fault me for this, right? I don't remember exactly when we added some of these fields. But this was in later versions where we added the shadow, midtone, and highlight contrast adjustments. But these fields here really, we used to say if you wanted to drive, slave printers to a master printer, right, you got the color in one that's really the perfect color and you wanted to drive the other printers. This is a place where you could do that because these values will be, offset values, will be applied to everything that gets rendered out of that printer. I think the piece that we might not have said clearly enough is if there's a 0 value then and there's a value somewhere else, what's going to take precedence. So example, if I had all in my brightness field in the printer data table, if I had all of those set to 0 and I had offsets in the printer queue, then the printer queue is naturally, the offsets are going to be applied that are in the printer queue simply because I'm not applying them here. I hope that makes sense. So if I do apply them here, right, I do, for some reason, I need to tweak the contrast of a particular printer. And again, when some of these features were designed, we were running printers directly out of DP2, right? We were running something like an LED printer. So maybe we had 3 or 4 and we were driving a certain effect that we wanted to be applied to everything that went through that printer data table. So those are, it's an important concept if you want to be able to do something at a global level. But that doesn't mean if there are zeros in here that 0 is going to override something else, because it's not. And that's an important kind of tweak to that whole concept that when we think about precedence, I wanted to be sure that it's an if-then, right? And sometimes that adds to the confusion, right? Well, if this, then that. A lot of it depends, again, on how you're set up. So I want to make this kind of an easy way for me to make that point. So there are some other things that as I kind of walk through, I'm not going to go through every field in every one of these tables. But I do want to talk a little bit here about using the printer wizard. And the reason I want to talk about using the printer wizard here is because there are going to be cases where when you use the printer setup wizard, right, we are going to populate the appropriate script in the appropriate place so that you don't have a situation where you have conflicting data, or your data that you think you have in the queue isn't overridden by data that for some reason you add in the printer, because of course you can add it here, right? It's a field in a data table. So as an example, you'll notice that I have some scripting here when I set up the Noritsu printer, and I set it up using the printer wizard. But I don't in a lot of my other, these fields, although they will exist to some extent, not all of them, but they will exist in the printer queue. They will be using the printer wizard. They'll be populated there rather than here, because this is a case where when it comes to scripts, the printer is going to override the printer queue, right? And again, it's not a one-to-one match. There are certain things that are in the queue, and they're in the queue because you're controlling them from the queue on purpose. There are other things that if you don't have it in one place, DP2 is going to pick up the value from another table and so on. So if you didn't, for some reason, and there's a number of labs I can think of who have this case where they're not putting perhaps the resolution in the job, they might be putting it in the printer queue, or they might be using a script override, or you'd be using the overrides in the queue. But in here, you still have that value. And depending on what the value is will determine, and whether or not it's populated in a field in a specific table is going to determine who wins, I guess is the easiest way. So the output path is a good example of who wins, right? So when you create a printer and a queue, you have one opportunity to specify the output path. Generally speaking, that's the way it stays, and the output path is consistent, because the output path is one of those places where you've got, the printer data table is essentially going to win. However, it's only going to win if there's nothing in the job. And this becomes really important to know. So as we think about how we're going to put together our printers and our printer queues, if you're not using the printer wizard and you are going in here and you're modifying the scripts and you're using macros to populate, either the file name or something about the output or where that job is going to populate, what folder it's going to end up in, or what printer it's going to go to. It's important that you pay attention to the different values. If you are, the job, when you create an output spec in the job, if you think about it, what you do is you specify a queue. So the queue is going to have an output path. And if you were, however, to write an output path right into the job itself, and as we go kind of back through each of these pieces, I'll revisit this and I'll show you what I mean by that. So if you had an output specification that was written right into the job itself, as to exactly what you wanted that job to do, and I know that I think a number of you that are attending this might have a scenario just like that. Or you might be using a particular type of product that does something where that's necessary. That's going to override whatever else you have in the printer queue data table or the printer. But if you don't have that and you haven't set it up that way, and you may be doing that for very specific reasons, right? If you've got jobs that are coming into the system and you don't have a lot of human operator interaction with it, but it's automatically printing, you might very well have the whole thing set up to not only be automatic but to completely bypass your operators. And in a case like that, whatever you've done in that scenario is what's going to hold true. So I want to kind of just go through as we're looking at that. So a couple of different other fields that I think are critical. One of these, of course, is the file type. And again, it's defined first in the job. However, if for some reason you either don't do it that way or the value is missing, whatever scenario you might come across. And again, these are things that we're kind of protecting you from somebody making a mistake, right? We're kind of creating an open scenario where you could do whatever you wanted to do. So the first thing that happens is that we look to the job. And if for some reason the job doesn't have that information, because the job will override the printer data table, which is where I'm at, the printer will override the queue. So if there's nothing in the job that tells me this is what I want to do, then the printer is going to override the queue. And you may do that intentionally. You may decide, and an example of that might be to force PDF output or to ensure that you're getting PDF output to where you want it to go. If it has PDF in the printer, and for some reason you've elected to not include it in the job itself, then the DP2 is going to default to what's in the printer. And so those are a couple of the different fields. There's one exception to some of this, which is, and we'll look at that when we look at the printer queue data table, and that is if you're intentionally using overrides. So as an example, a resolution override in the printer queue will override what's in the printer data table. So as we kind of go back through here, so this resolution, and again, there are labs who intentionally do not set a resolution up in the job. They might not even set a resolution up in the print queue, but they might have it driven by what's here in the printer, or they might use the printer overrides in the print queue in order to kind of make those make it possible. Those are the types of things that can be really confusing. But the design is to ensure that you can make whatever decision, especially if you're automating, that you need to be able to make when you need to be able to make it. And of course, the when is really at the heart of a lot of that. So I'm going to take a pause just for a second and see if I have any questions. You can raise your hand. I know I didn't talk about raising your hand, but you can if you have a question. I'll just take a moment. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the printer queue data table. I'm going to leave my printers open so that I can kind of walk back to it if I need to. So there's a lot of other data a lot of other fields in the printer queue data table that allow certain types of functionality that we really don't need at a print level, that we might not want to manage it job by job, right? But we want to be able to kind of look at our workflow in addition to that. And I'm going to go down to the back end so that I can sort of highlight, right? So here's our contrast, right? So if you had a value in here and you were dialing up a value here and you had 0 in the printer data table, again, what's going to happen is DP2 is going to default to that value that's in the printer data table. It's going to use the value in the printer queue if the values in the printer data table are blank. Sorry about that. So as we look through, and I'm going to highlight a couple of different things in here so that I can. There's some things that I kind of want to talk about as we go through the jobs itself and kind of what happens in the output spec. And kind of before I get there, I'll just highlight one of the things that happens in the printer queue, and kind of pretty much only in the printer queue. Boy, only is a big word for DP2, right? So it's handled primarily in the printer queue. Once we get into the jobs and into orders and into customer data tables, there's a number of different things that you can do in order to be able to manage your color. But I want to highlight a couple of different things because really color management is implemented in the printer queue data table. We make decisions about color management all the way through, right? We make decisions about how what we want to have our operators see. We make decisions in our WYSIWYG environment. We make choices about, what profile we're going to use as working space, those kinds of things for the operators, right? A lot of what's happening here, we're driving back to, does the operator see, and is the operator able to match what we're driving out of the printers or whatever your output device is. But even though, and I'll reiterate this actually came up a couple of days ago in another ticket, is that color management out to the render, out to the printer, is handled through the printer queue. What happens for the operators on a day-to-day basis, that's really just allowing them to render it on screen, to see and soft proof what's going to be happening out of the printer and match that print to what they see on screen. But there are some things, if it's been a while since you visited the printer queue data table, right? So neutralized grayscale, right? So under normal circumstances, when DP2, and again, not 100%, but under kind of an average workflow, when DP2 sees the input and the output profiles for a particular job, and there's not a lot of things that are, from a color management standpoint, that are being applied in between, it skips kind of the operation of converting it from one thing to the other. So if your input profile is sRGB and your working space profile is sRGB and your output profile is sRGB, then DP2 is going to kind of take a pass at it. Now, there's a couple of situations that are specific, and the neutralized grayscale, and I know we've covered in other places, but this is really the only place that you're going to be able to do this, is the ability to, when DP2 understands something as a black and white image, DP2 is going to go ahead and if you have neutralized grayscale selected, it's going to skip the color management operation so that no kind of color, not artifacting is probably too strong a word, but any kind of color bias inherent in an ICC compliant workflow, it'll skip it. It says this is black and white, I don't need to worry about the color, so to speak, doing it loosely. But I want to just point that out because I think it's an important concept in terms of the printer queue data table to understand that this is where your color management is actually getting implemented. Force output type, right? There's the force. This is where if you wanted anything to go through that goes through your workflow. So if you had a PDF workflow and you just wanted everything that went through that queue to be PDF, then you would force a PDF output here. So that regardless of whether it started life as a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF or whatever it is, your rendered output file would be a PDF. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on printing, rendering intents, and soft proofing. We do recommend, though, that for printing using perceptual, because of course that massages that color information into the working space of the printer rather than the printer profile rather than clipping it. So it's kind of important. And again, here are those color offsets that I talked about earlier in terms of just the basic, red, green, brightness, red, green, blue, contrast, gamma, and saturation, which, again, no value, you're all set. If you have values, you just want to make sure that the values that you have in one table kind of complement what's happening in your printer. So the resolution override, which I referred to earlier, if you're using overrides, there's a little checkbox to use overrides. That override is going to, you can see it right, there's the printer resize override and a resolution override. So these will impact and override what's going on at the printer. So those are places that you might intentionally, you've decided that the printer queue data table is where you want that kind of emphasis, so that's really what you're going to do. And you're intentionally driving that result. You could let it all ride from the job, you do everything in the job, but I know that there are labs that have automated in ways that are forcing a resolution here at the printer queue, so I want to make sure to highlight that. So the compression quality, again, you'll notice that we didn't, I'm going to actually go back. So if you look at some of the data, although we have file type up here in the printer data table, we've got resolution, this is where you enable noise reduction, but you'll notice that we actually don't have a compression quality field in the printer data table. This is something that's driven out of first the job and then, of course, the printer queue. And again, the job is king, but I just wanted to point out that if it's been a while since you've been in this table, just to notice. So one of the things you're also going to notice is that the control and response folders are here in the queue, right? We didn't see them in the printer data table. They're here in the queue. And, but again, if you were to, for some reason, go in here and manually edit your printers or your printer queues, you're going to want to be a little careful about how you're doing it. Some other fields that I don't know when these were added, but I want to be sure to point these out. You can, if you have the programming skills, and I know many of the people on this call do have those programming skills. I'm not a programmer, but that said, if you are writing your own scripts as a level of automation and you want to be able to interact with the rendering process, and I'm kind of using that as from the time that you run the order item, no matter how you do it, to when it's output to the printer. If you want to do things along the way, there's opportunity here, and DP2 will understand, right? It's, you'd put them in the scripts folder, right? And then you choose, but after parsing script. So there is actually a chart, and one of the things I am going to do as a result of this micro-learning and the micro-learning on Thursday, which focuses, on some of the setup things and some of the things that happen in the printer setup and the printer wizard. But if you do want to interact with those, we're going to create some charts, some error messages, some things that we'll either put in the help or we'll post in Service Desk so that you can have access to those and hopefully some examples. But so after parsing scripts, next batch script. So as an example, with the next batch script, you're automating it and you're using a script that's got some instruction in it that says use these parameters to go find the next batch, or the batch that fits those parameters, and then automatically begin that batch, or after load, before load. So you have a lot of different milestones within the process that you can interact with, and you can create your own scripts. Some of them that have been around for from the beginning and for a long time, right? Order complete, right? Depending on the type of printer, certain printers need certain bits of information, or a file name has to be done in a particular way. We have to tell DP2 or the printer needs to let us know that a particular thing has happened, so it's print complete as opposed to, or job complete as opposed to order complete. Some require a start print, script and so on. These are all the types of scripts that and I've seen some pretty sophisticated ones from some of you for doing very particular things, right? But again, this is another advertisement for the Printer Wizard, because when you're setting up a printer, some of these will automatically be placed in the right, either in the printer data table or in the printer queue data table, so that they are there and get invoked or become a catalyst for something else at the right moment in time. So I want to pause very briefly at the configuration field. I'm going to include Windows printers and configurations and all those kinds of things in the session on Thursday. Excuse me. So you'll be able to, we'll talk a little bit more about how some of those work and what's going on there. And here you can see noise reduction. We enabled it in the printer, right? And that's part of the setup. But here is where you'd actually implement it. So again, here's the output path, and you can see this output path is full of macros, and that's actually something else that we're going to talk about on Thursday in terms of the macros. Here's our save file type. And again, the save file type, if it's not in the job, but it is in the printer, we're going to use what's in the printer unless you're using overrides, just to kind of revisit it. I'm not going to worry about too much. If you're using a gamma table, or you're using some sort of a lookup table, this is you'll specify it here in the queue, and that's where it will be implemented. I don't know really how much that's true anymore, but that used to be especially specific to some of the, like the LED and the KPDM, some of the Codec Professional output devices. I'm not going to worry too much about paper fill. There's a couple of other things that I'll talk about in terms of if you have paper fill turned off, which is generally the state of affairs, right? Unless you're using a device that you've set up to go out to a cutter of some kind, or you're using an image break, or you've got something special that you've implemented. I'm trying to think if I've covered all my options there. But if you're not using paper fill, when paper fill is off, the job output spec overrides the queue, and in a case like that, the queue may override the printer. So if you're in a scenario where you're driving a result to a very particular type of device, right, this is going to be specific to a device, and it's one of those exceptions, the queue may actually override the printer. So these are the places where it probably wouldn't be if it were a disk queue, but I want to point that out just to be sure that I kind of covered that base in case there is. If it's been a really long time since you've been in here, and I mean a really long time, but there is the flip page field, which will allow you to flip a page or mirror it so that, in the whole page, so that you can use it for die sub, for making mugs and things where you need that opposing view, the mirror view of it, so to speak. I do want to talk a little bit about, beyond some of the things that I talked about, not just in the render engine, but in the printer data. The printer queue also has some methodology for understanding order size and managing order size. And this was implemented originally, I think, for the RPs when we were first introducing some of the printers that had the trays in the back end of them, sort of a mini lab iteration. So first order size says, okay, how big is my first order? And of course, if you ever sat in a lecture from Seth Irwin many years ago, Seth would say, well, if the order size is 2,000, but that means your printer is going to be sitting waiting for it to render out, you can set your first order size to something smaller so that then you can kind of create a less linear workflow, but you can kind of create some tiers to it. You can specify the maximum order size and the order size timeout, right? At one point, do we understand that something's going on and we need to take a pause? We can also have the opportunity here, and there's a couple of different things, and this is more specific to books and PDFs, right? Because of PDF, if you think about it, our original books implementation was to help doing double-sided work and collating it out to a printer. we've gotten a little bit more sophisticated since then, and there's a lot of other devices rather than just thinking about as simple books. But we have the ability to create a reverse sequence or to use book collation, and there's some other settings a little bit further up the workflow that are really required in order to be able to do that. But I wanted to point it out. You're going to notice my resolution here in the printer queue is set to 0, right? In my case, I'm using the job and I'm using my printer. But again, this is all really up to the lab to decide where they want these values. How are you using your different tool sets in DP2 to kind of make things work? And as I mentioned before, right, this is where our color management is implemented. So it's an important piece to the puzzle. And the rest of it is, pretty straightforward. I am going to just, I don't think I have too much work in here. So I've got a bunch of different job queues, and there's a couple of things about the job queue that I wanted to include in this discussion. I shouldn't have too much, so I'm going to go ahead and search it. I think I deleted lots of stuff. Oop, I could be wrong. And yeah, that's okay. So I want to just mention a couple of things about the job queue, only because there are certain things that happen in the job queue, right? And we used to say, right, this is our umbrella, right? The job queue, all jobs go to the job queue. And I think in the early days that was kind of categorically true. The more programming and the more modifications that labs make to DP2, the more often we'll see that jobs might get simply sent straight to the job queue from wherever they're coming into the lab. They might go straight through the job queue and right out to the printer. They might go straight to there's all kinds of ways to do things, because using commands.txt, creating your own commands, using some very sophisticated scripts that I've seen, a part of you in some of your labs. But I do want to point out a couple of things, and because this is really the place to do that, right? There are labs that use their job queue, really heavily in order to manage work. So the couple of things that I just want to highlight, remind you of, right, are of course the status, what's happened, what's going on, the ability to change the priority. But this is really where we see, and again, it's just a reminder to say, remember this? And you may be living inside of your job queue, but I felt like this was an important stopping point to kind of revisit what and where and what the flow and the process is, right? Because here's the queue name, the batch order, all of the things that we know about each individual one of these. So I think it's worth just kind of taking that pause to say, remember these guys. So, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because the job queue is different, right? It's not, although you can act on the individual jobs, there's certain things that you can do. There's information that you have here that could be really valuable depending on what's going on. It's different than the printer data and the printer queue data tables, which kind of house master information, if you will, about how something's going to happen. Whereas the job queue, it's transitory, right? Once the job is done, it's auto-deleted. Once you've changed whatever you need to change and sent it on its way, tells you who's got it, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit different in terms of, how it behaves. And I'm going to close these because the next piece that I want to talk about a little bit is the actual, the products and the jobs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the product because there are certain things that I want to just reinforce in terms of the product, and I'm going to try to just take a few minutes and then give you the opportunity to ask questions or share ideas or thoughts, or I'm going to actually go into the KPDP2 folder too, because if you're not familiar with some of the scripts that I referred to earlier, I want to kind of show you where you can see some of that. You could go in and kind of take a look at it. And yeah, I know many of you have already done that and are good at it, much better than I will ever be. But in any given product, and I'm just going to open up a product, it doesn't really matter which one. But of course, I'm going to look for the one I want. So there you go. I've been doing a bunch of different testing to kind of test resolutions and do some other things, but I'm just going to open up an 8x10 because what I want to talk about is the output spec. And I'm going to do output to disk because I'm going to go through this more thoroughly when I'm talking through the setup on Thursday. But I want to talk about some of what's on these tabs and what you're driving to, and then I want to view this product as text. I might actually view it in the order rather than just as the product. I think it's important because there's a difference between, well, that can be a big difference, right, depending on what's driving it, how the job got created, or whether you created it manually and you have all the information, or you created it automatically and all it says is the job and it references the layout and it gives you other data. So to get, we say this, right, when you create a product, first thing you should do, regardless of the kind of product, is to define the output spec so you don't forget, right? Because then they go off into the disk queue. They go off onto La La Land. And, right, is the file type. And if you leave all of these at 0, right, so say I specify that I want a JPEG, but I don't put any data in any one of these. I leave it just the way it is. Then it's naturally going to default to either the queue, or if you have the information there, or the printer. And you might decide that that's the workflow that you want. It really will depend. But if that's not what you want, you could define it here. And a case where you might want to define it here is if you have a lot of artwork. So if the default resolution, and you can see it here, is at 100, and you're trying to manipulate backgrounds, or you're trying to work with frames, or you've got masks, or any of those other kinds of things, it may make more sense for your operators for you to go ahead and put the resolution at 400 so that way, I'm just going to activate this so that you can see. What will happen is you'll be working in that 400 pixels per inch. So it could be a much more operator friendly environment, not just for the jobs and the products, or not just for the products, but also as the order items come in, because then they can check to see are things in the right place and so on. And they may, and again, it's going to depend on your workflow and how you have things set up. But when you're kind of in the creation process, if you will, depending on how you've created your layout, whether you're using an auto-size product that's going to auto-size to the image that populates it, or you've got something very specific that you're putting artwork in for, and you might even be using, different backgrounds that are populated by a macro or some other form where you know what the background's going to do and you know how the background's going to behave, or you want to be able to have the operator check and validate it. A lot of it's going to depend on the size lab you are, the type of work that you're doing. So those are some of the things that, you have to think about here. Because when we get into this part of the workflow, it becomes much more important that you're interacting and thinking about how is the operator going to see this, and is the operator ever going to see it? Is there certain pieces of information that become important here? So earlier I was also referencing output file. So as an example, when I'll set this up normally, or I'm not actually going to save it, but so I specify my queue, and it's any one of the queues that are relevant to disk, right? So it could have been anything. And this is the information that will get saved as part of my product. That depending again on how I have the rest of my workflow and what kind of automation I'm using, I may want in there or I might not. I can also specify an output file. So if I were, I'm in composites, I must have done something else today. So if I were, going into, let's get in here, and I had output specifications that I already wanted to use, or I had saved one, right? I can go ahead and, that's right, I can go ahead and I can save that output spec, and then I can use that output spec as part of my product. I can do certain things. This is where I would put annotations in for backprinting and so on. There's a couple of other things just from a color management standpoint, and again, these are just little reminders about output profiles, using different values, using a specific one, using an override, right? So I do have the opportunity to ignore my printer queue, right, and don't embed it. I can use the value in my printer queue. So again, these are all kind of interactive pieces that speak to precedence, that speak to, making mistakes or having an unanticipated result. The same thing is true if you're using multi-page sequencing in PDFs, you're not using books, you're doing something, because this was actually, I think this preceded books. But again, these are things to think about in terms of overall how you want it to behave, because when you think about what a book does, right, a book is designed to help you either create a long sequence in order or to be able to create a series of books that you run so you get front and back. There's all kinds of sort of ways to tweak and improve or enhance your workflow based on the decisions that you make here, in your output. And I'll just activate this and I'm going to save it. So when I go in here to view as text, and this was something that I wanted to, right, this is what DP2, when it comes to output, this is what DP2 is going to be using and looking for, right? So here's that output spec, right? And this is basically going to drive my result, and determine what's happening, and whatever bits and pieces of information, again, depending on how did you create your jobs. Is your job just referencing a layout? Is the output spec in the layout? Are you driving that result in a way that's going to complement the decisions that you made in terms of order and precedence in the fields that are in some of those other tables? So I'm going to stop. And I think this is really what I wanted to kind of bring you through. A couple of reminders about your customer, and I'm actually going to open up that order. I realize that we're getting really close to the top of the hour, so I'll apologize for that. I want to be respectful of your time, but I also want to just really quickly, when you are looking at customer data and order data, there's a couple of different things that can impact, and this is just from a color standpoint as an example, but we do have a couple of things that happen in the customer data table. I gotta get past some of this. So as an example, we have abstract profiles which can be used at a customer and an order level. Those are applied during the color management operation. So if you have an abstract profile that you are using to drive a particular result for a particular customer, that abstract profile is kind of applied between the working space and the output. So as a function of when we are applying those numbers to those images, this is applied within that operation. And it's just kind of a reminder from an overall color standpoint, depending on what you're doing. And also, if you're using offsets, although these offsets are not applied in the same sense as the kind of print workflow offsets for the printer queue and the printer data table, they are being applied to the job. So it's just kind of another aspect of some things that are happening inside the job that may or may not have an impact on something that you're doing further on down the workflow. And so that's really it. It's just about 5 minutes left. I want to open it up and see if we have any questions or suggestions. You just raise your hand and then I'll know that you have a question. All right. Well, since no one's raised their hand, I'm going to assume that you have no questions. I'm hoping that most of this is things that are just gentle reminders of where things are and what's happening. And with that, I will let you get back to your afternoon. Thank you all very much for attending. I really appreciate it.